This is the long-awaited 85mm version 2 from Sony. It completes their final 1.4 lineup with the 24, the 35, the 50, and now the 85. But is it that much more improved over that old version that many of us have a little bit of issues with? Let's check it out. Now, I don't get to keep this lens. I'm literally sending it back to Sony the second I finish recording this video, but I've had it for the last month or so and actually got to take it to Europe with me and make a ton of amazing images, both portrait, landscape, you name it. I basically have photographed it in the last few weeks. So I've made about 1,000 different images with this lens. And despite the fact that I don't get to keep it or anything like that, this is definitely not a long-term review. I would say that it is a pretty darn decent first impressions. And as someone who has shot like hundreds of thousands, if not more, images with an 85mm over my lifetime, I definitely have a lot of opinions on them. So take that for what you will. Now, the history here is, in the wedding photography world, 85mm is just such a good all-around focal length. It obviously is good for portraits, but honestly for coverage stuff is where it's kind of the sweet spot for me. It's close enough where I can still kind of be in and amongst things, but it's also far enough where, especially if I'm doing things like speeches or vows during a ceremony, I find that 85mm is just a really, really good setup for that. And for at least 10 years, probably longer, I basically just used a 35mm and an 85mm. Those were my staples. And again, I've shot hundreds of thousands at least photos with an 85mm. Now, you might be wondering then, why do I not have an 85mm in my current kit? I have a 35mm, the 50mm. I'm probably going to swap this 20mm out for the 24mm soon. And then I have the 135. And that was because all of those lenses are fantastic. I really love them, use their performance, all that kind of stuff. But when I tried out the 85mm, it was fine, but it just didn't have that same level as like the 35 or especially like the 135. The fact that I don't use this lens nearly enough, I basically bought this because I wanted to get the 85, but I just knew it wasn't going to make me feel it just wasn't like, it didn't have the right autofocus performance. It just didn't have the same sharpness and level of reliability, it felt like, that I was expecting. So I picked up the 135, and although I adore that lens, it's just not as useful to me as an 85. So that's why I was waiting for this lens to come out for forever and ever and ever. And not to exactly spoil the review, but obviously this thing is just as anticipated, if not better. So first off, I mean, anytime you put a lens hood on something, it's going to look enormous. But for an 85 1.4, this combination really isn't that big. I carried around the 85 1.2L on my 5D series for years and years. So having something this small and compact obviously is really, really beneficial and useful. But while I am working as a photographer, I usually do toss the lens hood on there just so that I'm bonking into stuff or whatever. I'm using 2 cameras at a time on like that dual camera strap system. So this is what it looks like, but it isn't nearly as kind of heavy as you would assume there. According to Sony's charts that I have here and the spec sheet, it weighs 180 grams less than the previous version, which also wasn't enormous, but any weight savings I can get is going to be fantastic. And it weighs 642 grams, which for an 85, a fast 85, is amazing. And while we're at it, we might as well just hit the rest of the specs. You have a 77mm filter thread on the front. Minimum focus is 0.85 meters, or just like a little bit less than 3 feet. We have 14 elements in 11 groups. Obviously, internal focusing, you're not going to see any movement in the front there. And then also an 11 bladed aperture, which is really, really nice if you're going to be stopping down for things like groups or anything like that. You're not going to get that hexagonal or, I mean, whatever pattern you end up getting. You're going to get round bokeh as you stop down for that, just a softer background look. Now, the other thing that's highly improved on this over the previous model, which for portraits and things like that were totally fine on the previous model, but this is so much snappier, especially on on any of the newer bodies, but I'm sure anything else. I've tested this on the Sony a7R5 and then the Sony a9 III, which is obviously going to be their top performers in terms of autofocus. And I have plenty of times of my kids running around in Norway where I was just photographing them running back and forth, and every single photo is tack sharp on the eye. No issues, super snappy. So both in terms of speed and reliability, obviously this thing is fantastic. And to be honest, if it wasn't, it'd be really weird because all of Sony's newest and latest greatest stuff is just incredible. But it is definitely the first 85mm that I've ever used, like a fast 85mm that is, that like I feel like you could actually use this as a sports lens if it was something that you needed like the low light and that particular focal length with. And that just obviously isn't the case for the vast majority of 85mm lenses out there. I'm also told that the autofocus can keep up with the whole tracking at 120 FPS, which is just bonkers. But in my testing and my real world use, I can see that being the case. Now, while I don't have the other 85mm, you just get all of the newest and like typical things you would expect out of a Sony lens. You get a fully clicked or declicked, whichever you prefer, aperture ring here. You get a manual focus kind of override, or if you want to use it as manual focus, you get two of the kind of custom button here. I use those for the like Super 35 crop, which on an A9 III is like not going to give you a lot of resolution, but on something like the A7R5, is absolutely worth it. Now, all the specs are good and great, but let's check out some of the images I made with these things, and we can come back and actually give you my final thoughts on this. Obviously, sharpness, fantastic. Autofocus performance, fantastic. I do think that the autofocus elements on the bokeh and everything like that also look good. There was never a point where I thought this is too much cat's eye or too, like, it just didn't look harsh or anything like that. And with a lens that is just as sharp as this thing is, sometimes you can get some weird stuff in the autofocus elements. But to be honest, this is 100% the lens that I have been waiting for in this system. It's the one lens and the gap in my Sony system that I've just honestly been waiting for them to update. And now that they did, it's one of the things that as soon as I got this and started using it, I messaged my Sony contacts and was like, hey, can I get a early pre-order on this thing? Because I'm 100% going to buy one of these. And while the original 85 is not a bad lens by any means, and some might prefer it for its character and things like that, especially if you are into portraits and you don't need the faster autofocus, just having those updates in this thing was something that is going to be worthwhile to me. It's definitely something I'm going to be adding to my wedding kit, which will finally kind of give me like the whole the circle is now complete thing from Star Wars, to really feel like I've finally built out a Sony kit that is complete and not lacking in anything. So thanks so much for watching. If you want to check out my video on the A7R5, you can do that up here. Check out my video on the A9 III and drop any questions you might have on this there, and I will see you all in the next one.